Hello, and welcome to my video on how to make hard Italian cheese. You know, the kind that starts with the letter P, the kind that you grate onto pasta and put on top of Caesar salads. The type of cheese whose name shall remain unsaid, so as not to incur the wrath of those Italian cheesemakers in that particular region of Italy. And if you see anything you like here, please let me know by leaving me a like or a comment or maybe even subscribing. Thank you. For today's recipe for hard Italian cheese, we're going to be using 14 liters of 2% cow's milk, 3/8 of a teaspoon of thermophilic starter bacterial culture, 1/4 teaspoon of lipase powder dissolved in 3 tablespoons of non-chlorinated water, 3/4 of a teaspoon of calcium chloride in 1/4 cup of non-chlorinated water, 1 teaspoon of liquid rennet in 1/4 cup of non-chlorinated water, as well as an 18% saturated brine solution. So for that, you're going to need pickling salt. If you have any questions about the equipment that you see me using or the setup that I use to heat my milk, let me know in the comments and I will be happy to explain. So as always, the first step is going to be to heat the milk up. And here you can see me measuring the temperature. It's at 18 degrees, and something I wanted to show you is after you stir the milk up and measure the temperature again, you can see that the temperature drops 3 degrees. So whenever you're measuring the temperature of the milk, make sure that it's moving or that you've stirred it up. Okay, so we're gonna raise the temperature of the milk to 33.3 degrees Celsius as our first step. All right, then we're going to sprinkle the thermophilic bacterial culture on top of the milk. This is a freeze-dried product, so we need to rehydrate it. So to rehydrate it, we're just gonna sprinkle it on top of the milk without stirring it in at first. As always, put a lid on top, set a timer for 5 minutes, and that 5 minutes is going to allow that bacterial culture to rehydrate. After the 5 minutes is up, we're going to stir the bacterial culture into the milk. Just make sure that you move the milk from top to bottom, bottom to top as you stir, and stir it for about 1 minute. Okay, once we're stirred up, we're going to be ripening the milk, and that's just going to be having it sit for 45 minutes, allowing that bacteria to start converting lactose into lactic acid. All right, see, I almost put that ingredient in there before I got the milk moving. So we'll get the milk moving a little bit. And the next step is going to be to add the lipase. I use what's called sharp lipase. There's mild lipase and sharp. I like to use the sharp lipase. And we'll give that a stir. And now for another 15 minutes of ripening with the lipase inside. 15 minutes later, get the milk moving again. We'll add our next 2 ingredients. All right, first is the calcium chloride. We'll give that a stir. And then next we'll add the rennet. And we'll stir the rennet for not more than 1 minute. Always remember, as the rennet starts doing its job of coagulating the milk solids, we don't want the milk to be moving around too much, so no more than 1 minute. And as always, at the end of adding rennet, we want to slow that milk to a stop. Make sure it's not moving around so the coagulation can work. All right, now we're going to let that set for 45 minutes. All right, 45 minutes later, the curds have set, so we're going to check for a clean break. Yeah, looked nice and clean on the first try. So the next step is going to be cutting the curds. And with these hard Italian cheeses, they're a little bit different. We want to cut the curds into... Yeah, I didn't believe my first check, so I'm checking again for a clean break. We want to cut the curds into a bunch of small, about lentil-sized pieces. So I'm starting by going all the way up and all the way down through the entire curd mass with the balloon whisk, all the way around the curd mass, and then just sort of concentrically in towards the middle. After you've gone all the way through, it's time to go around the circumference and just gonna sort of twist the whisk a little bit as it goes down to pull the curds away from the side of the pot. And now we're gonna continue to just pull the balloon whisk through the curds, bringing the bottom ones up to the top, making sure that the curd size is roughly even. We don't want a lot of big chunks and a lot of small chunks. We want them to be all as similar as possible so that when we're heating them, they'll be expressing whey out of them at about the same rate. In all, I would say that it's about 15 minutes worth of cutting these curds up this way. Okay, so 15 minutes later or so, the curds are mostly even. If you find any rogue big pieces as you go along, just like that one right there, just press them against the side and cut them up. Don't worry too much because as we go through the next part of heating the curds and stirring the curds, you'll have a chance to break up any larger pieces. So the next step is going to be to slowly raise that temperature up to 51 degrees Celsius over about 1 hour. And you're going to have to stir continuously for that entire hour. So I would suggest pull up a stool, maybe put on some good music because you're going to be there for an entire hour stirring away, building up those arm muscles. So that's about an hour later. You can see that there's a change in the color of the whey, and you can see that the curd pieces are smaller now because the heat has squeezed the whey out of the curds. This is also why we use a thermophilic bacterial culture, because it can withstand the heat. I went a little higher, 52 degrees, but that's okay. What I'm doing here now is showing you the size of the curds. You can see that they are indeed a fair bit smaller. And what I'm going to be doing here in a second is testing the curds to see if they're ready to be pressed. And the way that I do that is by taking a handful of them and squeezing them together. And if they stay together without falling apart, but then are able to break apart easily into individual pieces again, then I know that the curds are ready to be pressed, and they are indeed. So 5-minute timer, and what we're doing here is just going to allow the curds to settle to the bottom of the pot and stick together. So the next thing we're going to do is press the cheese curds. And to do that, I've taken a stainless steel colander, put my cheese mold into that, and then put a cheesecloth soaked in white vinegar into the cheese mold as well. So we're just going to pour the curd and whey into the cheese mold. And just fold the cheesecloth over the top of the curds. Put the follower in. And what you're seeing there is my homemade cheese press. If you have any questions about how I made this or what the parts are, leave me a message in the comments and I will answer your questions. I have since moved to using 3 smaller mason jars just to give the press a little bit more stability. So the first pressing is 25 pounds for half an hour. As you start pressing the curds, the whey is going to start seeping out. It should be totally clear like you see there. You don't want to see milky colored curd. That means you're pressing the milk fat or the proteins out of the curds, which is where the flavor lies. So it should press out nice and clear, just like that. All right, half an hour later, we're going to flip the cheese over and then go for our second pressing. So we'll get the cheese out of the mold. And as you're pulling the cheesecloth away, just be very gentle. The cheese mass itself is not very well formed yet, and it will tend to stick a little bit even with the white vinegar. So just be gentle as you're pulling the cheesecloth away. And that's how it should look, nice and smooth on the bottom end. And we're just going to flip it over and put it back into the cheese mold. Second pressing is going to be with 50 pounds for 12 hours. Yes, there is a joke in there somewhere about using exercise dumbbells to make cheese. All right, so here we are about 12 hours later. We're going to take the cheese out and we're going to brine the cheese. I just used this little vegetable container. The reason I like it is it had that plastic top part, which helps to keep the cheese fully submerged in the brine. The reason we brine the cheese is you'll notice that salt wasn't an ingredient that we added, so the brine adds salt and flavor to the cheese. It also preserves the cheese, and as it's sitting submerged in the brine is pulling moisture out of the cheese. And these hard Italian cheeses are fairly dry for cheese, and so we do have to pull a fair bit of that moisture out, and that brine will do that really well. Again, if you have any questions about how to make brine, let me know in the comments, and I can maybe make a video on how I do the brine. It's fairly simple. So we're going to keep the cheese submerged in the brine for a total of 18 hours, and we're going to turn over once at the 9-hour mark. So here we are at the 9-hour mark, and we're just going to flip that cheese over and put it back in there for another 9 hours. Okay, so the next step in the process is going to be to dry the cheese. So I've just used sort of an upside down plastic tray with a bamboo mat on top of that to wick some of the moisture. And then I'm just going to take the cheese out of the brine and I'm going to place it on there. I'm going to cover it up with the bug net just to make sure no hair or dust settles onto it. And we're going to let the cheese air dry for around 3 days till it's dry to the touch. And you're going to want to flip the cheese over twice a day while that's happening. At the end of the drying process, the cheese should be dry to the touch and have a good rind developing on it. And that's just a hard cheese crust, so to speak. To age the cheese, I've put it into a vacuum sealed bag and vacuum sealed it. And we'll just put it into the cheese fridge, which is basically a wine fridge, but I use this as my cheese cave for 8 to 12 months at about 12 degrees Celsius. And I'm gonna flip the cheese over once a day or so for the first week or so, and then I'm going to flip it over once every week or every other week for the rest of the aging period.